It was a Sunday morning when Pastor Elijah decided Amara didn't deserve to be there. Not in that church, that sacred space where the faithful came seeking blessing and restoration. And it was right there, in front of 200 souls, that he humiliated her. Amara was 34 years old. Her name meant grace, a legacy from her grandmother who would whisper it like a blessing before sleep. She was a woman of small, firm build, the kind who carries the weight of labor in her hands and dignity in her eyes. Every Monday, she woke at 5 in the morning to clean the homes of the neighborhood's wealthy families. Every Saturday night, she counted the coins she had saved inside a coffee jar, silently celebrating each hard-earned dollar. And every Sunday morning, she put on her only white dress purchased at a thrift store 5 years ago, mended and cared for as if it were made of gold, to come to the Church of Redemption. Because Amara believed. She believed in God, in miracles, in undeserved grace. She believed that suffering had purpose. She believed that her life, even though so hard, was part of a greater divine plan. It was faith that woke her every day. It was faith that kept her going. But Pastor Elijah had other ideas about who deserved to be in his temple. The Church of Redemption was no ordinary place. It was large, elegant, with dark wooden pews and stained glass windows that cast colors on Wednesday afternoons. The men who attended there were lawyers, businessmen, entrepreneurs. Their cars, Mercedes, BMW, Audi occupied the parking lot like a declaration of faith and prosperity. The women wore designer bags, imported heels, jewelry that sparkled under the temple lights like promises of success. And there was Amara. Every Sunday, in the back pew, wearing that mended white dress, her feet in worn sandals, her calloused hands clutching the worn bag she'd mended 100 times. Pastor Elijah had never said anything. His silence was worse than any words. It was a silence that spoke to everyone. You don't belong here. On that special morning, when Amara arrived and sat in her usual spot, she felt something different. A murmur ran through the church, eyes fixed on her with an intensity she'd never felt before. Something was planned in the air, something that had been brewing for weeks, perhaps months, during the prayer meetings held at the pastor's house, where elite women discussed the temple's problems. Amara didn't know she was one of those problems. Pastor Elijah stepped up to the pulpit, his voice filling the sanctuary with the authority he'd built over years of powerful sermons. He began to speak about purity and worthiness, about how this church was reserved for those who truly understood faith and success. His eyes swept over the congregation. They rested on Amara. They fixed on her. There are those among us who only come to take, he said coldly, who seek God's blessing without understanding that blessing is earned. You must be worthy of God's grace to receive it. The church went silent. Amara's heart pounded so hard she thought everyone could hear it. She was the target. She was the example. Everyone knew it. This church is a house of prosperity, the pastor continued sharply. We are a community of successful people. If you cannot contribute to that success, if you cannot elevate this congregation through your wealth and status, then frankly, you don't belong here. Then, looking directly at Amara, his smile turning cruel. Perhaps you should find a church more suitable to your circumstances. A church where you'd feel more comfortable, with your own kind. The women looked away. The men exchanged knowing glances. No one said anything. No one defended her, because in their logic, if you were there, you deserved to be. If you weren't successful enough, you didn't. Amara slowly rose. Her legs shook, but her face was stone. She picked up her worn bag. She walked to the door while Pastor Elijah kept preaching. The entire church watched her leave like it was part of the show. When she walked out the front door, the sun beat down hard on the parking lot. The luxury cars gleamed. Amara walked in a straight line between them, her worn sandals on her bare feet, the white dress which had never looked so old swaying lightly with her steps. No one called her back. No one ran to apologize. The Church of Redemption remained silent, except for the pastor's voice, which continued to speak about purity and deserving. But something happened the moment the door closed behind Amara. Something none of those present could have imagined. In that instant, when she felt that mix of shame, anger, and a strange clarity, as she walked down the street back home, her hands in her pockets, her heart pounding, something stirred within her. A door no one knew was closed began to open. Because Amara had a secret, a real secret. That worn white dress wasn't a symbol of defeat. Those coins in the coffee jar weren't idle hope. Her 5 a.m. wake-up calls weren't about blind faith. They were about something else entirely. They were about a plan, a goal, a vision she'd been building toward all along. The church forgot about Amara that Sunday. The faithful returned to their homes, sharing stories about the pastor's brave sermon, about the importance of maintaining certain standards. Weeks passed. Months turned into years. 3 years. 3 years is long enough for people to completely forget. Long enough for an entire life to be transformed. long enough for a woman humiliated in front of 200 souls to become someone entirely different. Because while the Church of Redemption continued to peddle its theology of wealth as proof of worthiness, Amara was doing something no one knew, no one imagined, no one would believe when they finally found out. And when she returned, because she would return, nothing would ever be the same. What no one in the Church of Redemption knew was that there are two kinds of people in this world. Those who believe the world owes them something and spend their lives waiting for it to happen. And those who understand that the world owes no one anything, so they build their own destiny with their own hands. Amara was the second kind, and that's exactly the kind of woman who changes everything. The first days after Amara left the church were anything but quiet. The empty house echoed her footsteps, and the silence screamed louder than any words ever spoken against her. At night, when exhaustion finally set in, the tears fell. Silent, hot, bitter. She could have given up. Most people would have. The humiliation burned. The judgment suffocated her. But something in Amara refused to break. It wasn't arrogance. It was deeper, a resilience in her blood. A stubbornness that came from her ancestors. Those first months were pure survival. Poverty was real, no metaphor. She cleaned houses before dawn, styled hair at a small salon on the edge of town, sold homemade cakes at traffic lights. Her feet ached. Her hands roughened. The sun burned her skin. But she didn't stop. People stared. They whispered, "That's the woman the church threw out. The one who couldn't behave." Paying for her arrogance. Amara felt every look like a stone. But she lifted her chin and kept going. Because if she stopped, they'd be right. And she knew they weren't. Some nights she came home in agony, wondering if she could go on. Some mornings she cried alone in the dark, doubting everything. But then dawn came. She'd rise, shower, dress, face the day with only her dignity. The one thing no one could take. It wasn't a story of overnight transformation. It wasn't magic. It was work. It was persistence. It was the refusal to become what others believed she was. And then, approximately 5 months after leaving the church, something happened. Something that would change everything. 5 months later, everything changed. She was cleaning offices at night when a manager noticed her. Not just cleaning, but thinking. Organizing files better. Spotting problems no one had asked her to find. Because Amara didn't do anything halfway. That work ethic caught attention. In a world of barely getting by, Amara was different. Quality wasn't her goal, it was her baseline. Over the next months, things changed. Real change. Real progress. She began to work on something that demanded more from her. Something that challenged her mentally. Something that had purpose beyond survival. The exact details were unclear. There was mystery in her trajectory. The need not to reveal everything at once. But what was certain was that Amara was building something. Something real. Something that mattered. People noticed the change. Neighbors who'd whispered in disdain now whispered with respect. There was something different about her now, a deep calm. A real confidence. Those who worked with her saw integrity, precision, and solutions to problems others thought were impossible. Slowly, almost without noticing, she rebuilt her life from the ashes. Not the same life, not the same terms, but stronger, truer, aligned with who she really was. Time passed. Months turned into a year. A year turned into almost 2. 2.5 years. An eternity for transformation. Meanwhile, back at the church, nothing changed. Same sermons, same faces, same whispered judgments. Amara had become a ghost, an uncomfortable memory they preferred to forget. They deleted her, as if she'd never existed. The church remained stagnant, the same rituals, the same fear wearing piety like a mask. Nothing evolved. Nothing grew. But while the church remained still, Amara was in motion. While the community slept, she was awake, building, growing, transforming herself. There was a project in her hands now. There was a mission only she could fulfill. There was a purpose that went beyond anything anyone in that community could imagine. And with each passing day, she drew closer to something extraordinary. No one knew this. No one could know, not yet. But the universe always has its plans. Destiny always finds its way. And sometimes, the quietest stories are the ones that change everything when they are finally told. On the first Sunday of a perfectly ordinary month, as the congregation settled into their usual seats, something extraordinary was about to happen. The church doors opened, footsteps echoed in the silent aisle, and when the woman who entered was seen, the air in the entire room seemed to shift. Because the woman walking down that aisle was not the Amara of 2.5 years ago, and absolutely no one recognized her. Sunday began like all others at the Church of the Eternal Tabernacle. The pews were full. Voices rose in harmony during the morning hymns. Pastor Elijah preached in his usual manner, with sweeping gestures and words that penetrated deep into the souls of his faithful. But there was something different in the air, an invisible tension, like an out-of-tune instrument in a perfect orchestra. Then, the back door opened, and absolute silence fell upon the temple. Amara walked down the church aisle with a grace that seemed almost mesmerizing. Her steps echoed softly on the ancient wooden floor. She wore an elegant navy blue dress with delicate finishes that whispered quality and refinement. Her hair, once always tied back with simple cloths, now fell in wavy curls, shining under the natural light from the church's tall windows. Her shoulders were back, her spine perfectly erect, and there was something in her face. Something that was not arrogance, but a deep peace that radiated from within. "Amara?" a voice whispered. "Is that her?" another asked, more to herself. Whispers ran from pew to pew like fire in dry brush. Eyes wide, mouths slightly agape, some seemed frozen, unable to process what they saw. The woman who had left 3 years ago, rejected and humiliated by the community, was here, and she didn't look like the same Amara. At the pulpit, Pastor Elijah froze. His hand, which seconds before had gestured with conviction, slowly dropped to his side. The words that flowed naturally from his lips simply stopped. He saw her, and when he recognized her, something flickered in his eyes. Guilt, quick and sharp as a knife. Because Pastor Elijah had been one of the first to suspect her, one of the first to question her faith when her marriage collapsed, one of the first to turn his face away when she needed compassion. And now she was there, radiating everything he had said she would never have. Strength, dignity, presence. Amara found an empty pew and sat down, bowing in a discreet reverence before standing fully. A gesture that was not of apology, but of respect. She wasn't seeking attention. Her entire body seemed to say she was there simply to participate, nothing more. The tension in the air was almost tangible. Some of the faithful hastily averted their eyes when she looked at them, embarrassed. Others stared at her with silent admiration. There was resentment too. That small discomfort that arises when someone you discarded returns better than you imagined they would be. But there was also genuine joy. Brigida, the widow who had always been kind to Amara, had tears silently streaming down her face. Pastor Elijah tried to continue his sermon. He really tried, but his words had lost their weight. He preached about redemption and grace, about forgiveness and renewal. Every word seemed to echo differently now, ironic in a way that was not intentional. His eyes kept returning to Amara, as if she were a magnet pulling his attention against his own will. And when it was time for the offering, everything changed. The copper plate began its journey, passing from hand to hand. Coins dropped, crinkled bills. The faithful placed their contributions as they had for years. It was a ritual. But when the plate reached Amara, she didn't place a simple coin. She took out an envelope, white, tightly sealed, and placed it on the plate with a calmness that suggested she wasn't giving alms, but making a promise. The face of the deacon holding the plate changed completely. His eyes widened, his jaw dropped slightly. He looked at the envelope as if he were holding pure gold in his hands. When his eyes met Amara's, he merely whispered, "May God bless you." But everyone saw it. Everyone noticed his reaction. And that reaction unleashed an avalanche of silent questions that swept through the congregation like waves. What was in that envelope? How much had she put in? How could she, someone who had left with nothing, now possess enough for the deacon to react that way? Pastor Elijah sat down as his sermon ended, but his mind was racing. Guilt and curiosity pulsed in his chest like a discordant rhythm. He had prayed for her many times over those 3 years. It was true, but he hadn't truly expected her to return. Or if she did, he had secretly imagined she would come back destroyed, broken, perhaps seeking his guidance and his forgiveness. Instead, she had returned radiant. And that envelope, that damned envelope that had brought tears to the deacon's eyes. When the service finally ended, the congregation stirred. That welcome chaos of hugs, greetings, and conversations that always concluded Sundays. Amara remained in the pew, chatting briefly with Brigida, offering hugs that were returned with genuine affection. But there was a certain cautious distance that most maintained. People wanted to approach. Their pride robbed them of that right. And then Pastor Elijah saw her getting up to leave, her elegant purse hanging from her shoulder. She was moving towards the door when something inside him screamed. He couldn't let her leave. Not without knowing. He caught up to her in the aisle, placing his hand on her arm with a gentleness that masked his urgency. "Amara," he said, his voice laden with something between pastoral authority and personal desperation. "Could you wait a moment? I'd like to speak with you in my office." She turned and her eyes met his. In that gaze, Pastor Elijah felt something he had never felt in his 20 years of ministry. A reversal of power. He was the pastor. He was the spiritual guide. But in that moment, under Amara's calm and penetrating gaze, he felt like a student being called to explain his behavior. "Of course, Pastor," she replied, her voice quiet and firm. "Can I help you?" Yes, he said, the urgency now more visible on his face. I would very much like to, in private. As they walked through the church corridors towards his office, Pastor Elijah's heart pounded. He had so many questions. Where had she been? How had she transformed so completely? What was in that envelope that had so impressed the deacon? But there was one question that pulsed above all others, burning and unshakable. What happened to you these last 3 years? And the answer he was about to receive would not just be about Amara. It would be about everything he had believed about faith, redemption, and forgiveness. It would be an answer capable of shaking every certainty he had built throughout his life. In that office, surrounded by the walls where he had offered counsel to countless souls, Pastor Elijah was about to learn that some people don't need his forgiveness to be redeemed. That divine grace doesn't work in the sequence he had taught. And that sometimes when you have rejected someone in their darkest moments, you are left behind in that darkness, waiting for them to return to save you. Pastor Elijah took a deep breath. The silence of his office was deafening. The privacy of that space, which had always comforted him, now seemed accusatory. Amara entered with a composure that disarmed him. There was no bitterness in her gaze, no resentment. There was only the calm of one who knows her own truth. "Sit down," said the pastor, his voice betraying the mixture of defensive pride and curiosity that consumed him. He was not allowed to be confused in front of this woman. He was the leader, the guide, the man who had the answers. And yet, there was Amara, with her shoulders straight, her gaze firm, as if she were the one offering wisdom instead of seeking it. "You've changed," said the pastor, not as a question but as a veiled accusation. Amara smiled, not a smile of triumph, but of understanding. "Yes, pastor, I have changed, but allow me to tell you how." And then she began to tell her story. Amara spoke about that first day, when she left the pastor's house with empty hands. No money, no references that mattered. Only her determination and the promise she had made to herself that life wouldn't end like this. She slept on the streets for 2 weeks. 2 weeks! She looked for work on every corner, knocked on every door, faced every refusal with gritted teeth. No one wants to hire a woman with no history, no references, not even a place to call home, she said, her voice low but firm. But I learned something during those first few months. I learned to observe, to listen, to anticipate what people needed before they even knew it. She found work in a small office, a humble job as an administrative assistant. The salary was small, barely enough to pay for a rented room in a distant neighborhood. But Amara worked with a dedication her employers had never seen. She arrived before others, left after. She didn't just perform her duties. She noticed what else needed to be done. "There was a woman leading that department," Amara continued. "Her name was Helena. She saw something in me that I had forgotten to see in myself. One day she called me and asked, 'Why aren't you leading already?' The pastor blinked. Helena had seen in Amara what he had not. Competence, potential, merit. "She offered me opportunities," Amara said, her voice subtly rising. "Courses, greater responsibilities, important projects, and I seized every single one of them as if it were the last I would ever be offered in life. Because for me it was..." Amara described the years that followed. Nights studying, weekends working on special projects, saving every penny, learning business, finance, people management, observing Helena, studying her decisions, understanding market patterns that no one else saw. And then came the moment that would change everything. When Helena found herself pressured by the company's administration, there was a massive project that no one could execute. A contract that could generate millions, but required a vision that the previous leadership lacked. She entrusted that project to me, completely. The pastor leaned forward, captivated by the narrative. "I didn't sleep for weeks," Amara confessed. "Not out of fear of failure, pastor, but out of fear of losing the chance to prove to myself that I was worth something. More than what you saw in me. More than what the world tried to tell me I was." She paused. Silence hung between them, heavy and significant. The project was an absolute success. "Pastor, that contract yielded double what was expected for the company. The previous leadership wanted to celebrate Helena. But Helena knew who had truly done it." The pastor felt the ground beneath his feet disappear. "She proposed something that would change my life forever." She said, "Amara, you no longer need to work for anyone. You are capable of building your own empire. Let me invest in you. Let's create our own company." Amara's voice grew stronger, more confident. The moment had arrived. The moment that would make everything make sense. "We started this company practically from scratch. Just Helena, me, and an idea that I knew would work. We worked hard, intelligently, strategically. And pastor, that company grew. It grew exponentially. It grew in a way I myself had never imagined." Pastor Elias felt his heart race. He knew what was coming next. He had already heard whispers about a remarkable businesswoman, someone who appeared in economic magazines. He had never connected that to the young woman who had left his home. "This cannot be," the pastor murmured. Amara continued, relentless. "I created dozens of jobs, Pastor. Dozens of people who now own homes, who have fed families, who have hope. You looked at me that day and saw dishonor. You saw a woman who had failed. You saw poverty and presumed unworthiness. But what you really saw was yourself, your own fear, your own judgment." The words fell like lead upon the pastor's chest. Each one true, each one devastating. "How?" he asked, his voice a whisper. "This is impossible. I didn't know." "You didn't ask," Amara replied. There was no recrimination in her tone, only fact. "You weren't interested in knowing. You saw a conclusion and assumed you knew it. But life, Pastor, life doesn't work according to our assumptions about others. Life works according to the value we carry within ourselves, and I carry a value you never recognized." The pastor leaned back in his chair, the air escaping his lungs. He had made a mistake. A profound mistake. A mistake that had cost a woman everything she loved. And now, that woman had transcended his rejection in a way that completely humbled him. Amara watched the pastor process the truth. His reaction was almost exactly what she had imagined. The shock, the guilt, the attempted justification that would never come. "Why did you come back?" the pastor asked, his voice brittle. "Why did you come back here to tell me this?" Amara leaned forward. There was something in her eyes that the pastor couldn't quite decipher. "A secret, an old promise. Because I made a promise to myself," she said. "I promised that one day, when I was finally successful, when I finally achieved everything I knew was possible, I would return. I would return to this place, to this house, to this church. And not as the rejected woman who left here, but as the woman who proved to the whole world that you were wrong." The pastor breathed with difficulty. Amara stood up. With deliberate slowness, she reached for a bag she had left in a corner of the office. A white envelope emerged from her hands and was placed delicately on the pastor's desk. "This envelope," she said, her voice taking on an almost mystical tone, "contains something I tried to send you a long time ago, but I never found the courage to deliver it that way. Today, in your own space, in the privacy of what is yours, I want you to open it. I want you to see exactly the magnitude of what you rejected in me. Of what your assumptions cost not only me, but so many other people who could have been more." Pastor Elijah looked at the envelope as if it were a snake. His heart pounded against his ribs. "Open it," Amara whispered. The pastor's hands began to tremble as he reached for the white envelope. The silence in the room was so intense that he could hear his own heart pounding. Amara stood, observing every detail of his reaction. With each movement, the suspense grew. His fingers seemed heavy, as if that paper held not just numbers, but the weight of a lifetime of wrong judgments. Finally, he pulled the letter out. The pastor's eyes scanned the lines. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. He read it again, and again, as if the numbers made no sense. His skin paled. His hands began to tremble visibly. The paper almost slipped from his uncertain grasp. He whispered, This, it can't be true." The amount was staggering. A donation that alone could transform the church's entire future. It wasn't just money, it was a statement. A number that screamed how badly he'd misjudged her. Pastor Elijah tried to speak. His voice came out hoarse, broken. "This is more than our congregation's entire annual budget. It's more than we've raised in 5 years. How did you get this?" Amara walked to the window, looking out at the city below. When she turned, her eyes shone with a strength he had never seen before. "I am your church's biggest donor now, Pastor. The biggest donor." She let the words hang in the air. "You want to know how I did it? Because you genuinely want to know, or just want to understand how badly you treated me?" Amara asked. There was no anger in her voice. There was something worse. There was quiet disappointment. "When I left here years ago, you told me I was worthy of nothing. Not even of being in your church. Not even of being blessed. Not even of being seen. You planted in me the idea that the only value I could have would be through contribution, sacrifice, total submission to the judgment of people like you." Pastor Elijah shifted in his chair, trying to respond. But Amara continued. "Well, I took that lesson to heart. If the only value I had was what I could contribute, then I decided to contribute beyond all measure. I decided to be so valuable, so successful, that not even you could reject me again." She took a deep breath. When she continued, her voice was steady but emotional. "I left here and I worked. I studied. I built a business from nothing. Today, that business is worth millions. I own it. I run it. I employ dozens of people. I have power. I have everything you said I could never have." The pastor's breathing quickened. Millions. The weight of those words crashed over him. All the rejection he'd caused was confronted by the magnitude of her success. Success he'd witnessed from the outside without ever acknowledging it. But do you know what was the worst part? Amara continued. When it became clear that you and this entire congregation were completely wrong about me, you didn't even apologize. You just ignored me. You passed by my store without recognizing it was mine. You saw my success without wondering where I had come from. And some of you even pretended you never knew me. She walked to the pastor's desk and placed another folder before him. This money isn't just a donation, Pastor. It's the materialization of my success. And I'm giving it to something that goes where you never cared to look. I'm funding a shelter program for young people like I once was. Boys and girls rejected by their communities. People your religion discarded. People you discarded. Pastor Elijah opened the folder with trembling fingers. Inside were detailed documents for a scholarship program, for access to professional opportunities, for restored dignity for those who had been trampled. Each page revealed hundreds of lives that would be touched. Hundreds of people like Amara had been. 563 people have already gone through my support program, Amara said, her voice gaining strength. All of them are like I was, rejected, diminished, told they weren't worthy. And I'm helping each of them become as undeniable of rejection as I am. Pastor Elijah's eyes filled with tears. They were not tears of joy. They were tears of brutal understanding, of remorse, of guilt that had no escape. Amara, I didn't know. You didn't want to know, she replied, her voice firm and clear. Because knowing would mean having to confront what you did. It would mean having to admit that your judgments about worthy and unworthy, about valuable and worthless, were completely wrong. Pastor Elijah collapsed onto the table. His shoulders shook. He had lost all composure, all authority, all capacity for justification. There was no defense. There was no explanation that made sense. There was only the enormous void between the person he tried to make Amara be and the extraordinary woman she became despite him. But what Pastor Elijah didn't know was that the news was already spreading through the church. A secretary had seen the donation. An assistant had mentioned it to a member. Within hours, the entire congregation knew. The woman they judged. The one who escaped their rejection. The one who now returned not as a supplicant, but as the one who had the power to change everything. And when the truth spread completely, collective guilt descended upon the congregation like a dense fog. Every member, consciously or not, had to face their complicity in the judgment, the rejection, the dehumanization of Amara. The deacons realized they had been as blind as the pastor. Members who had known her since childhood recalled moments when they could have said something, done something, but didn't. All of them were in a situation no judge would want to be in. Suddenly and without warning, having to confront the terrible magnitude of what they had done. And the woman they had rejected was now the greatest savior their institution would ever have. And so, the following Sunday, as the entire congregation gathered, Amara walked to the pulpit, the very pulpit from which she had been condemned, from which Pastor Elijah had proclaimed she was unworthy to be there. She took a deep breath and looked at each face in the congregation. There was nervousness, there was anticipation, there was fear. She was about to speak, and no one had the slightest idea what she was going to say. The sacristy door slowly opens. All eyes turn. It's Amara. And this time she walks towards the pulpit. Not to leave in shame, but to stand before her community. The place denied to her 3 years ago is now hers. The irony is so profound that the church air seems to freeze. She ascends the steps with determination. Her hands rest on the sides of the dark wooden pulpit, the same place where Pastor Elijah proclaimed blessings for the rich. The silence is deafening. It's not the silence of curiosity, but the silence of guilt, of remorse, of people who know they made a terrible mistake. Amara takes a deep breath and begins. 3 years ago, I left this church broken. Not just broken by exhaustion, but broken by rejection, broken by humiliation, broken by discovering that the place that should have welcomed me had decided I was unworthy. She pauses. Her eyes sweep the congregation, finding the faces of those who ignored her, those who whispered. When I left here that Sunday, it was raining. I remember every step I took to my small house in the forgotten streets of this city. I remember falling to my knees in my room and asking God, why? Why did you abandon me in my greatest moment of need? Why did those who pray in your name decide that my suffering was not worthy of compassion? Tears begin to stream down her face, but her voice remains firm, powerful. And do you know what God whispered to me that dark night? He said, Amara, they didn't see you. Their eyes were trained to see only gold and mansions. Their hearts were closed to everything that doesn't shine. But that doesn't determine your worth. Your worth is here. She places her hand on her heart. Over the past 3 years, every day has been a journey of discovery. I discovered that my mother, the woman I raised alone after my father passed away, had a spirit stronger than any fortune could ever buy. I discovered that my true friends are not those who frequent elegant churches and wear expensive jewelry. They are those who sat by my side when everything was falling apart, and offered me a plate of food prepared with love. She inhales deeply. You saw my poverty and assumed my unworthiness. But let me tell you a truth that took me 3 years to truly understand. Worth is not measured in bank accounts. Worth is not calculated by the size of your house or your investment portfolio. True worth, the worth that matters for eternity, is measured by character. It is measured by faith. It is measured by love. Amara's voice echoes through the church, and each word falls like a hammer on the community's conscience. During these 3 years, I worked as a nurse. I cared for patients with no one. I sat with sick children through the night. I taught kids to read. I fed homeless women. And in those moments, those real, human moments, I felt God's presence more than I ever did in this sanctuary. She looks directly at Pastor Elijah. Her eyes meet his. I came back to remind you of something basic, something Jesus taught, something you've forgotten while counting your money. That compassion, real compassion, matters more than pride ever will. Then, just as Amara reaches the climax of her revelation, something unexpected happens. Pastor Elijah slowly rises. His entire body is trembling. Tears stream profusely down his face. Not tears of falsely dramatized remorse, but true, deep, devastating ones. He walks to the front, to the foot of the pulpit, and kneels. I was blind, he whispers, his voice breaking. So blind I couldn't see God's light in you. Amara, forgive me. I failed you. I failed all of us. The entire congregation begins to weep. Women cover their faces with handkerchiefs. Men bury their heads in their hands. Guilt, true repentance finally arrives. And in this moment, everyone understands. Amara did not come as an accuser. She came as a cure. Amara descends from the pulpit and extends her hand to Pastor Elijah. He takes it, and in doing so, she helps him up. They embrace, and the embrace seems to encompass the entire congregation. It took me 3 years to forgive, Amara says, her voice reaching everyone. And I learned something. Forgiveness isn't weakness. It's power. It's freedom. What follows is a transformation none of those present will ever forget. The congregation walks up to Amara, one by one. Some apologize. Some embrace her knees. Some share their own stories of rejection and isolation they had never revealed to anyone. And as this happens, structural change arrives too. Weeks later, the church council announces new policies. No member will be excluded based on their financial status. Church funds will now be allocated to social assistance programs. The church space would become open not just for worship, but to serve the poor in the community. But the greatest transformation is invisible. It is internal. It is spiritual. Amara remains in the church when the crowd disperses. She sits in the back pew, in the spot where she used to sit 3 years ago, when she was invisible. But now she is not invisible. Now she is seen, truly seen, and she whispers a prayer of gratitude, not for vindication, not for the redemption of her name in the community, but because she finally understood that her worth was never in their hands. Her worth was always within herself. Remember this, Amara's voice echoes. The person you judge today could be your greatest blessing tomorrow. Never assume you see the truth. The truth is invisible to eyes trained to see only surfaces. This is an ancient teaching, one that Jesus proclaimed, one that heals communities and restores souls. Share this story. If it moved you, if it made you think about people you've misjudged or opportunities you've missed, share it. Because stories like this don't spread through algorithms. They spread through hearts that have been touched. Subscribe, because we have more stories. Stories of transformation. Stories of ordinary people who became extraordinary. Stories that prove real wealth isn't money. It's character. It's compassion. This is Ancestral Echoes, where ancient wisdom comes alive again in modern hearts.